Hello everyone. Welcome to this session on environmental and climate change policies. I'm Mike Bourne from DEFRA, the UK's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And hosting this session, we've got Uris Baldos from the GTAP Centre. Got an excellent range of presentations today. Just a couple of points of etiquette. If you could mute yourselves unless you're presenting or you've been called on to ask a question. And the presentations will be 20 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes for discussion. And yeah, I think we can get to it. So I'll introduce our first speaker, who's Dominic White from Auckland University of Technology. And he's going to speak to us on the plastic intensity of industries in the US. So over to you, Dominic. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'll just share my screen now. So just double checking everyone can see my presentation. Yep, perfect. All right. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the plastic intensity of industries in the US, The Devil Wears Plastic, written by myself and Niven Winchester. So as a brief overview of today's talk, I'll first be going through the key motivation behind the paper, followed by an overview of the literature related to our study, a description of the main data used and the methodologies used, followed by some key results and conclusions. So the main motivation behind this paper is the negative externality which comes from plastic consumption, which comes in the form of plastic pollution. Now, policies to date focused on reducing plastic pollution have focused on consumer-facing industries, such as supermarkets, and focused on consumer-facing plastics, such as plastic bags and plastic packaging. And this paper hopes to contribute to an understanding of extended producer responsibility by identifying the different plastic used by industries in the economy, and we do this by calculating the plastic intensity of those industries. What we mean by plastic intensity is the value of plastic inputs per dollar of industry output. We hope these results may help policymakers identify sectors of concern when formulating strategies to curb plastic pollution. Okay, so with regards to the literature, there are two main areas of literature that we looked at for this. The first main area was plastic pollution, and the second area are the methodologies developed for input-output analysis. For the plastic pollution literature, we focused on plastic pollution in waterways, and the reason for that is the majority of plastic pollution ends up in the waterways when it goes into the environment, and that's because waterways are an environmental sink. Now, one of the key papers behind this is by Gaia, Jambak and Law, who estimated of all plastics ever produced, 30% are currently in use, 59% are in landfills or in the environment, 10% have been incinerated, and 1% have been recycled and are currently in use. They further discovered that 7% of all plastics have been recycled, but 6 of those 7% have been put back through the economy and are now in landfills in the environment or have been incinerated. They also find that the shortest lived plastics in the economy tends to be packaging plastics. Now, Ernie Cazzola et al. And Moray Ferguson et al. Look at the plastic makeup in waterways. So Ernie Cazzola et al. Look at a meta-analysis on plastic pollution in waterways. And Moray Ferguson et al. Took ocean water samples from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to see the type of plastics that they found. And the main plastics found by both of these sources in the ocean include polypropylene, which is a type of plastic used in packaging, textiles, and as parts of cars, polyethylene, which is used in medical devices, plastic bags, and plastic wrap, polystyrene, which is used in disposable coffee cups and dinnerware, polyester, which is used as fiber in clothing and recording tapes, polyamide, which is used in nylon, latex, and synthetic rubber, acrylic, which is a synthetic resin used in plastic glass, polyvinyl chloride, more commonly known as PVC, which is used in pipes and flooring, and polyethylene terephthalate, more commonly known as PET, which is the main plastic used in drink bottles and microwavable packaging. Now, Ernie Cazzola and Moray Ferguson et al., along with other sources, identified the type of plastic which has the biggest environmental impact is microplastics. And so these are microscopic pieces of plastic that end up in waterways. And the reason why they're so dangerous is because they start with a high level of buoyancy, and over time that buoyancy decreases. So it sort of interacts with every layer of the waterway ecosystem. And the main contributors to these microplastics are polyester and nylon. Now, the techniques we use to calculate plastic intensity in this paper build on the methodologies developed for input-output analysis. Now, I've listed some of the key studies here, and that includes Leontief and Forge, which is sort of a fundamental paper that shows how to determine embodied pollution with input-output data using a set of simultaneous equations. Hurwicz and Peter applied this methodology to determine embodied carbon. Bullard, Pena, and Pilati combined input-output analysis with process analysis to determine embodied energy use. And Pomponi et al. Combined input-output analysis with life cycle analysis to look at the potential environmental impacts from a change in the size and shape of plastic milk bottles. So to determine plastic intensity, we use the EORA Global Supply Chain Database, which is a multi-region input-output table, and it comes in two key forms. The first form is a multi-region table, and the second form is individual country input-output tables. We focused on the US individual country input-output table for our analysis, and the reason for that is it had the most clear-cut plastic commodities described. What I mean by clear-cut is it had commodities that were clearly just plastic. They weren't combined with other things such as natural rubber. The US individual country input-output table has information on 428 different industries and commodities, including 13 plastic commodities. Now, using the analysis from Ernie Cazzola et al., Moray Ferguson et al., and Gaia, Jambak and Law, along with other plastic pollution sources, we identified 7 of these 13 plastic commodities, which are more likely to contribute to plastic pollution. And these included coated paper and plastic film, which is things like bread wrappers, wrapping paper, and cling film, plastic bottles, which is self-explanatory, polystyrene, which includes disposable coffee cups and dinnerware, plastic resin, which includes nylon resins and elastomers, plastic packaging materials, which includes flexible packaging, such as the plastic wrap used for freight, plastic fibers and filaments, which includes things like polyester, cigarette filters, nylon, and cellophane, and synthetic rubber, which includes latex and silicone rubber. Now, to determine the plastic intensity of each industry, we had to consider the use of plastics both directly and indirectly. A direct use of plastic occurs when an industry uses inputs of a plastic commodity. So, for example, if we're thinking of fiber, yarn, and thread mills as the industry, and they use plastic fibers and filaments as an input into production, that's a direct use of plastic by fiber, yarn, and thread mills. An indirect use of plastic occurs when an industry uses an input that was produced in part using plastic. So, for example, if we're looking at carpet and rug mills as an industry, and they use knit fabric as an input into production, and knit fabric uses plastic fibers and filaments as part of their production, carpet and rug mills as an industry is indirectly using plastic fibers and filaments in their production. The technique developed in this paper to determine plastic intensity builds on the methodologies used to estimate embodied carbon emissions, embodied energy, and embodied waste. And the key difference between this paper and other papers is other papers tend to use things like the GTAP database and other input-output analysis that have single commodity output data. The EORA database has multi-commodity input-output data. So we use the techniques developed in Lenzen and Ruder-Kentouche to adapt these input-output analysis for multi-commodity output MRIO data. So this is the main equation that we use to determine plastic intensity. Plastic intensity is represented by pi I. Di shows direct plastic use for each industry. I subscript I shows the indirect plastic use for each industry. And Yi shows the total output for each industry and puts this in an intensity form. Now, direct plastic use is a fairly straightforward measure to determine for each industry as using input-output data. You can see what the plastic inputs are, and you can clearly see which industry is using them. Whereas indirect plastic use is a slightly more complex task. So there's a couple of equations here which sort of summarize it. So indirect plastic use for each industry is equal to the plastic intensity of each commodity that's used by that industry, represented by pi subscript c, multiplied by the value of that commodity used by that industry, shown by U subscript I comma C, and that's summed across every commodity used by each industry. Now, to determine the plastic intensity of each commodity, that's based on the plastic intensity of each industry that goes into creating that commodity. And the reason why we have to take this into account is because this is a multi-commodity output data set. So this plastic intensity of each industry that goes towards creating that commodity is multiplied by the proportional value of that commodity produced by that industry. So for example, if we're looking at plastic bottles as the commodity and we want to determine the plastic intensity of plastic bottles, we know from the data set that 95% of plastic bottles are made by the plastic bottles industry, 2% are produced by the shapes plastics industry, and 3% are produced by other industries. This would mean that the plastic intensity of plastic bottles is 95% based on the plastic intensity of the plastic bottles industry, 2% based on the plastic intensity of the shaped plastic industry, and 3% based on the plastic intensity of other industries. Now, plastic intensity overall for each industry is determined separately for each of the 13 plastic commodities that I talked about a couple of slides ago. Looking at some of our key results here, so we can see here the top 10 most plastic intensive industries in the US EORA data set, and this is across all of the 13 plastic commodities. So we sum together the plastic intensities for each of these plastic commodities. We can see here that carpet and rug mills is the most plastic intensive industry with a plastic intensity of about 0.49, which means that for every dollar of output, it uses approximately 49 cents of plastic as an input. There's a couple of things to note about this graph. 8 out of the 10 industries described here are related to clothing and fabric manufacturing, with the two sort of odd ones out being used in secondhand goods and scrap. And the plastic commodity that contributes the most to plastic intensity in this graph is plastic fibers and filaments. Now, looking at the same graph, but just for those 7 polluting plastics that we identified a couple of slides ago, we can see here again, carpet and rug mills is the most plastic intensive industry for those polluting plastics, and 8 out of the top 10 of these industries are related to clothing and fabric manufacturing, with again the two sort of odd ones out being used in secondhand goods and scrap. And in yellow again, plastic fibers and filaments contributes the most to the plastic intensity of these industries. Now, there are 2 key issues with viewing plastic intensity in this way. One of these issues is highlighted by the fact that used in secondhand goods and scrap are present in both of these graphs, as they have the 2 lowest value outputs in the US EORA data set. And so industries with low value output, their plastic intensity will be inflated because any input into production will be seen as a large intensity. The second issue is that $1 of one plastic commodity is not the same as $1 of another plastic commodity. For example, $1 of $1 of plastic bottles is not the same as $1 of synthetic rubber. So to overcome these 2 issues, we looked at each of these polluting plastic commodities individually, and we compared the plastic intensity for each of them against the value of plastic as an input. And this includes both direct and indirect input. And the way we determine plastic inputs is by multiplying the plastic intensity figures by total output by each of these industries. So first, looking at plastic fibers and filaments, we can see here on the x-axis we have plastic intensity, and on the y-axis we have value of plastic inputs. So that's the value of plastic fibers and filaments used as an input. And this graph shows the 5 highest value of plastic input industries and the 5 highest plastic intensive industries for plastic fibers and filaments, and offers sort of an idea of the most efficient industries for policymakers and consumers to target if they want to reduce plastic fibers and filaments in the environment. Now, 8 out of 10 of these industries are again related to clothing and fabric manufacturing, with 2 standout industries being fiber yarn and thread mills and carpet and rug mills. And they stand out because they have both a high value of plastic fibers and filaments for an input, and also a relatively high plastic fibers and filaments intensity. So they offer quite an efficient targets for policymakers and consumers. Now looking at the same graph, but for plastic bottles, we see here there's a bit more of a clustering in the left-hand corner of this graph, and 6 out of the 10 industries described here are related to food and drink manufacturing. And there's one sort of standout industry, which is soft drink and ice manufacturing, which is not surprising given the amount of plastic bottles used by soft drinks and ice industry companies and things like that. But that offers quite an efficient target because, again, it has a relatively high value of plastic bottles as an input and a relatively high plastic bottles intensity. Now looking at coated paper and plastic film, we see here that there is again a clustering in the left-hand corner with a couple of outliers with regards to plastic intensity. So you've got photographic and photocopying equipment manufacturing that has a relatively high plastic intensity for coated paper and plastic film, but quite a low value of coated paper and plastic film as an input. And the same goes for scrap and used in second-hand goods. So policymakers and consumers looking to reduce coated paper and plastic film, it would be worthwhile targeting the printing industry, as that has both a relatively high value of input and high plastic intensity as well. Now looking at plastic packaging materials, we see here there's a bit more of a clustering with regards to the high value of plastic input industries and a high plastic intensive industries, with no sort of standout industries that have relatively high values for both. So as policymakers and consumers, the best thing to focus on in this case is those industries that have a high value of plastic packaging materials as an input. And the reason for this is if you have a higher value of input, that translates to a higher volume of plastic packaging materials. And if you're using a higher volume of plastic packaging materials, that's more likely to lead to plastic pollution. So policymakers and consumers should probably focus on motor vehicle parts manufacturing, general state and local government services, light truck and utility vehicle manufacturing, and retail and wholesale trade. Now looking at polystyrene, again, there's sort of a clustering in this bottom left-hand corner with 2 outliers with regards to high plastic intensity, and that's used in second-hand goods and scrap, but not surprisingly, they have quite a low value of polystyrene as an input, with the industry that would probably be the most efficient to target being food services and drinking places, which is not a surprise given that polystyrene is mainly used to create disposable coffee cups and disposable dinnerware. Looking at plastic resin now, we sort of have another clustering of those industries of high value of plastic input and those industries of high plastic intensity, with 2 sort of standout industries being all other chemical product and preparation manufacturing and paint and coating manufacturing, representing sort of efficient targets for policymakers and consumers. And finally, looking at synthetic rubber here, we sort of have that typical clustering in the bottom left-hand corner for different industries, with 2 standout industries, again, not particularly surprising here, one being tyre manufacturing, given that the amount of synthetic rubber that goes into making tyres and rubber in general that goes into making tyres, that's not surprising, and other rubber product manufacturing, both of which have relatively high synthetic rubber as an input and then synthetic rubber intensity. So as I said at the beginning of this talk, policies focused on reducing plastic pollution tend to focus on consumer-facing industries, and a lot of those consumer-facing industries include food and drink-related industries. And we found that for food and drink-related industries are plastic intensive for some plastic commodities, including plastic bottles and polystyrene, but they don't dominate the list of the most plastic-intensive industries, as might be expected. What we did find is that clothing and fabric manufacturing related industries are highly plastic intensive, especially for plastic fibers and filaments. And this is particularly concerning as plastic fibers and filaments include things like polyester and nylon, which are the 2 biggest contributors to microplastics. So these results indicate that future policies should potentially focus on discouraging plastic use in clothing and fabric related industries first, as an attempt to try and reduce the amount of those microplastics entering waterways and the environment generally. Results also demonstrate the potential value of using input-output data to determine plastic intensity, with that value increasing if there was an ability or a clear-cut ability to convert these values into either weight or environmental impact numbers, as has been done with embodied carbon and other forms of embodied pollution calculations using input-output data. Okay, thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Dominic. Very interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot about plastic, and I'm also mightily glad I bought my reusable cup this morning. So for questions, feel free to put your hand up or type a question in the chat. I might start things off. So you mentioned a couple of times the different kind of environmental impacts of different types of plastic. And I wonder, I think this is like, I mean, really useful for policymakers. And I think you've probably got, you know, the most important messages in terms of which places, which industries, commodities to focus on. But I wonder if an extension could be to move in a kind of social cost direction that like differentiates between the type of plastic being used and their impact, and whether that could kind of fill out the picture anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did sort of think about that a little bit. I think the biggest problem we have is that because the plastic data and input-output tables tend to be quite aggregated, as you could probably tell when I was describing them. It becomes more difficult because the papers that look in depth at plastic pollution look really specifically, and we don't have that specific data. So it becomes a bit, it does become a bit messy when you try and sort of build that up a bit. But yeah, no, absolutely, that would be, you know, really fill in the picture for sure.
Great, thanks. Does anyone have any other questions for Dom?
I had one. I just wanted to see if you'd thought about, with the database that you've used, does it have multiple years? And have you thought about seeing how the trend had changed, if it does, or is there an ability to extend it in that way?
Oh, that's it does have multiple years. We haven't looked at extending it, but yeah, that would definitely be worthwhile. Thanks. Yeah, because I think it goes back quite a few years. The only potential issue is I think the plastics which are described in each year do change, so that might be a slight issue. So we might have to focus on say polystyrene, or plastic bottles, which I think is pretty consistently reported, and just focus on that if we're going to go back. So we wouldn't have as detailed data, but that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions for Dom?
Yeah, I have a quick question. I was wondering whether it's possible to add information in terms of the recyclability of the plastics, because I imagine some of the plastics would be easily to recycle, like PET bottles and stuff like that, compared to like packaging.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And plastic bottles being its own commodity would make that quite easy. We did sort of think about that briefly, but looking into it, the amounts that's actually recycled and stays recycled it kind of makes it difficult, because even recycled plastic gets reused and then usually ends up back as pollution anyway. So it would be worthwhile thinking about it in terms of, you know, which plastics are the most recyclable, but you know, I'm not sure how effective recycling has been. To be honest, that's the only issue. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Oh, do we have one more question?
Yes. Do you have a sense of the magnitude of the environmental damage? Are they estimates of plastic damage?
So I believe there are studies that do calculate that. The issue that we have, which kind of goes back to Mike's question, is that because the commodities that we're looking at are quite aggregated, it's quite difficult to translate the information that's been the information on environmental damage for really specific plastics, which is what is often done, to this data. It becomes a bit messy, but we do have that information, and we'll look to try and extend this to include that.
Great, thanks very much. If there are no more questions, Xiurong, are you wanting to ask a question? I'm afraid we can't hear you at the moment.
Yeah, I think your mic is not working. Yeah, you're unmuted, but your mic is not working.
So you could type your question in the chat, but we will need to hear you later for your presentation.
You should be able to select, you see this little arrow up next to the microphone. You should be able to select from different microphones, and that might help.
Great, will do, thanks. Well, thanks very much, Dom. Let's give you a round of applause. Our next presentation is from Cedric Hodges from Deloitte Access Economics, and Cedric is going to be talking to us on the economic consequences of declining demand for Australia's fossil fuel exports. So over to you, Cedric.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone for coming along. I think the key thing to start with is this is work that I'm doing as part of my PhD, which I'm doing part-time, and when I'm not doing that, I work as a consultant doing CG modelling here in Australia, and it's been it's fair to say it's been quite the journey, as I'm told is often the case with PhDs, and I've presented previous work here, which was a kind of original part, a path that I was following, and this is kind of a departure from that path. And so in that original piece of work, I was using the in-house model we have here at Deloitte to look at kind of regional consequences and try and get like an outlook for thermal coal in Australia, and then a bunch of factors led me to shift. Like, key among them was that determining the likely path is probably more of a techno-economic model type question, and then there were a bunch of things around being able to kind of share the work, given that it was a proprietary model and things like that. So this is, although I've been doing it for a few years, this is definitely pretty new, and so I'm happy, very happy for people to kind of make suggestions and point out things where you think more work needs to be done, because it feels like there's a long way to go. So the issue that I'm looking at now is similar, in the sense I was looking at the future of thermal coal in Australia, and now I'm looking at something I guess a bit broader, but somewhat more almost stylized in a sense. The kind of starting assumption, right, is that there's going to be some decline in the demand for our fossil fuel exports, and for a bunch of regions fossil fuel exports, right, as the world transitions away from their use. The exact pace and magnitude of that change is very uncertain at the moment. There are times where probably people think it's going to be very fast, and other times where people think it's going to be very slow. In Australia, we just had a change of federal government, which has probably reignited some people's hope for domestic change, and so it's become pretty topical again here. But be that as it may, whatever reduction there is, there's going to be some. And according to a recent article by our Reserve Bank, having looked at all the stated policies and agreements and things from our major export destinations, it looks like coal exports could fall by a factor of 4 over the long run to 2050. And depending on the scenario they were looking at, LNG exports could fall by about 25%. Now, that was obviously for a good reason, and it's a good cause and things like that. So it's not like, you know, I'm against that change happening, but it's been pretty controversial, right? Climate change policy in Australia, and a key reason for that is that we make a lot of money as a country out of fossil fuels. They account for over a quarter of our merchandise exports, and we're a kind of small open economy. So they played a pretty key role in prosperity in Australia. It's not to say they're kind of faultless or anything like that, and they're not especially employment intensive. There's a lot of foreign ownership, so it's not what you'd call like a model industry necessarily, but it's one that has played a key role in Australia's economic development. The literature, obviously, for a question that broad, is very vast, and I'm not going to bore people with it here. But the way I've kind of approached it is just kind of, what do we know or think we know as a profession that would kind of guide us in answering that question? Because it is very much a prospective question, right? And one of the papers that I have referenced here, Dungy et al., was econometric and kind of retrospective, and looked at how Australia responded to different parts of the mining boom in terms of kind of crowding out a Dutch disease and things like that. And they, for example, in that work, found that the foreign demand shocks, in that case positive and negative shocks, can have quite significant but heterogeneous consequences for Australia, depending on the context in which they came. And so the kind of synopsis would be that the initial upswing in demand that we saw in the first part of the mining boom in kind of the early to mid 2000s saw quite a lot of kind of overheating and crowding out in the Australian economy, but that led to a supply side kind of increase in the sector, that by the time the second phase of the mining boom came into swing, when China instituted its GFC response and needed a lot of steel and iron ore and coal, the way they'd measured it with their structural VAR model showed that the Australian economy absorbed that shock a lot better. And so if you were to take that forward to this context, depending on the context in which we experience these kind of series of foreign demand shocks, it could play out quite differently. And another key question is just, are fossil fuels good, right, for an economy? Leaving aside the issue of climate change, obviously, is it a good sector or a bad sector? Obviously, Dutch disease gets its name from the discovery of gas in the Netherlands, and so it's not like there's a kind of sweeping admiration of them as a sector in driving growth in the world. But the consensus that I could find that was summed up in this recent book by Pesco et al. Was that they're pretty important when they're paired with strong institutions. And so, for every probably more developing country example where they've not been especially beneficial or led to a lot of growth, there are developed country examples like Australia and Norway and others where they have. So given all that, the question is, what can government do about it, right? And that's where a lot of CGE and even input-output analysis, as we just saw there, is kind of aimed at helping us understand. The key, there's two kind of ways to bifurcate that part of the analysis. What can government do to ease the transition, right? Noting that there's going to have to be one, or what could it do to potentially control the decline in production in a socially optimal way? If you were to look at it as a inevitable kind of like exogenous shock that's going to hit the economy, it's not impossible that the government could play a role in causing the reduction in production itself through an export tax, for example. And that's what the paper by Day and Day in 2017 showed could have quite positive impacts. So boiling it down, I kind of got a series of questions here. The first overarching one is, what are the potential impacts of declining foreign demand for Australia's fossil fuels? That's kind of the meta point. But then under that, there's also then the question of, well, given whatever the answer is, and I'll show some results here, but it still requires refining, what policies will be most effective in ameliorating these impacts? And do those policies differ depending on what policymakers are targeting? And what should they be targeting? I guess, should they be targeting national welfare, incomes of affected workers, total employment, some other measure? And I guess most importantly, given the kind of uncertainty in any kind of economic modelling of this nature, what factors are the answer most sensitive to, right? And so that's kind of a key part of it also. So I, as I'd said in the initial, a year or two of work I was doing on this, I was using our in-house model, which is similar to the GTAP variant, with the polite way of describing it, and so I was kind of looking at different policies in different countries and how they might play out and affect demand for thermal coal. And I'd split thermal coal into metallurgical and thermal, so you could show those different impacts and things like that. And I've since kind of moved away from that, and I've actually been using a version of ORANI-G, which is a kind of standard model that's out there based on the original ORANI model developed by Peter Dixon and others at the Impact Project in the 70s. And the key reason for that, obviously, is I needed a model which had kind of those four key characteristics. So I needed a sufficient level of detail, so I couldn't use a toy model necessarily, or I guess I could, but you would then not have much information to give policymakers. I needed something that was based on Australian data, given my questions about Australia. I needed something that people would understand and not have to learn, I guess, as it were. And ORANI is definitely one of the more widely understood models out there. And I needed something that is itself publicly available. There was no qualms with me sharing it with anyone, so that they could kind of check it and build on it if they wanted to. So for those who aren't familiar, ORANI-G is the best way to describe it would be, it's just your typical CGE model, right? You've got nested production and consumption decisions. It's a single country model, so you've got export demand that's determined, basically exogenously, and there's a whole web page on it and a bunch of resources and things like that if you're interested. And so I won't kind of bore you with much of the details here. But the one thing I will note is the key departure I've made from what would be the standard version is to adopt the approach that others have of having multiple households. And in this case, as shown in the image here, I've got a household type, which is kind of like a construct of your typical miner or mining-based household, those who work in the fossil fuel industry, basically, and then everyone else is included, as the other type of household. And so what that allows us to do is obviously look at, a bunch of macroeconomic impacts and causes and outcomes, and sectoral also, but then look at some more kind of detailed impacts on households. And that's really been the key issue in Australia, I think, is the lack of understanding around the different magnitude of impacts you might expect depending on where you live and what you do for work. And so that's the kind of key innovation. The data base I've kind of constructed following the procedure that is standard to the ORANI model and to most COPS models, based on the latest Australian input-output tables. At present, I've got it kind of reasonably aggregated to 34 sectors, and I've aggregated fossil fuels themselves. So I'm not looking at specific coal versus gas versus oil impacts necessarily. And the reasons for all of that really are to kind of keep it, I guess, a bit agnostic in some ways, because different people have very different views about what's going to happen with coal versus gas and different types of coal and things like that. And so I wanted to keep it reasonably higher level in that regard. But other than that, it's it's all pretty standard fare in terms of database construction. The key thing to note, I guess, for those who aren't that familiar with the sector or the sector in Australia in particular, is obviously it's a big sector in terms of the value of exports, for example. But it's not especially employment intensive, and it's not it's not particularly high taxed, I guess, compared to some other sectors. And so there's a bunch of things to consider there in terms of what any kind of impact would likely be. The model I'm using at the moment, and this might change subsequently, is comparative static. And so rather than describe a bunch of baseline assumptions to you, I'll just go through the closure, which itself is a pretty kind of standard closure, I'd imagine, for long run analysis, whereby the nominal exchange rate, noting it's a single country model, serves as the numeraire. All taxes, preference shifters and productivity variables are exogenous unless they're otherwise swapped out for a simulation. The rate of return on capital is exogenous, and the capital stock can adjust, and that's a long run assumption. And kind of contrasting that, the level of employment is assumed to hold constant, and labour market impacts are instead assessed by changes in the real wage. On the kind of household side, balance of trade to GDP is swapped out for the level of household consumption, which is a kind of standard single country type assumption, and government consumption in the model is exogenous at the moment. So that's kind of the key closure choices. And in terms of policies, and this is, like I said, it's reasonably preliminary, and I'm open to a bunch of suggestions, but at the moment I've just tested it in terms of saying there's some decline given I've used 10% at the moment, and I'll end up using, I guess, a range of potential impacts. And importantly, because going back just quickly to this equation, I've shopped F4Q, which is the way to think about that is the demand curve shifting from right to left, so contracting in quantity terms. There is also a price shifter, right, which I've not touched, and so that the simulations results that you'll see next are with a 10% decline in that quantity demanded by foreigners as a given, and then against that I'm testing the impacts of different policy interventions, and at the moment, and again very open to suggestions, I've just taken the simple kind of assumption of saying whatever policy it is that I'm considering, and as you can see at the end there, I've considered a few that don't quite work at the moment. They're aimed at ensuring that the change in disposable income for the mining household is no worse than the change for other households in percentage terms, obviously, because they're different. They've got different incomes. So against that, that shock, or in response to that shock, you might say, and with that in mind, the two things I've got to show you today are a compensating lump sum transfer and an across the board export subsidy. They're obviously pretty rudimentary at the moment, but the idea, I guess, there would be with the first one, it's kind of the most, I'd imagine, the most kind of like economically neutral of policies, but it would have analogues with a bunch of just transition type policies that have been used in a bunch of other places in the world, and so there's some real merit in thinking through what that does to the economy and to workers. And then the second one is probably more aimed at looking at the concept of, if the issue is foreign demand, as I'm saying it is here, then what can Australia do to kind of ensure that other export commodities that we have, of which iron ore would be a classic example, but a bunch of other mining commodities were stimulated. How would that go at offsetting the impact? So the results shown here from left to right and across three different policy simulations show the change in total exports, and you can see the 10% shock in in the quantity demanded for fossil fuel exports, isn't 1-for-1 in terms of total exports, and the macroeconomic consequences are pretty benign. The light green is uncompensated, and you can see the impacts on GDP are around 0.25 or 0.26%. G&E is a little higher because of the terms of trade effect. The real wage, is closer to GDP. But the key difference, obviously, once you dig down a level or two, is this idea of looking at it in terms of the mining workers themselves, or the households on which the prosperity is dependent on mining, versus other types of households. And you can see here, this is the disposable income lost in response to that 10% uncompensated shock. Is about 3.5 times what it is in the other in the rest of the household sector. And so it's perhaps understandable the kind of apprehension that exists. The dark green shows the impact of the compensating transfer, and so you can see, as I flagged before, by design, what they do is they bring these two bars here. Both policies bring the change, or the loss in disposable income, to the level of that experienced by the other types of households, noting that I don't control the disposable income of others, and a bunch of policies that I'm still trying to refine. We'll get this to some level, but then this will go crazy, right? Because it's a household with different characteristics itself, and so both the export subsidy, across the board export subsidy, and the compensating transfer do the same thing when it comes to the mining workers' welfare, but they have quite different macroeconomic consequences, I guess it'd be fair to say. Unsurprisingly, an export subsidy, the light blue, does what you would expect it to and stimulates exports, right? And so even in response to a 10% fall in what is a key export for us currently, that across the board subsidy, which I must admit I haven't costed fully, is it sees that go positive, right? Whereas the compensating transfer doesn't really do anything to exports. When it comes to GDP, it actually pushes it slightly positive as well, whereas the compensating transfer, kind of by design, I guess, has almost no effect on GDP, because it is thought to be kind of a lump sum kind of costless transfer. Whereas there's still some effects on gross national expenditure, and the effects on the real wage, again, are quite different between those two policies. And I guess the key reason there is that the first one, while I said it is the most pure and kind of and perhaps optimal in some ways, it's just targeted at that group of people, right? Whereas the second one, is targeted at encouraging exports and production, which is naturally going to increase the demand for labour and the real wage in the long run. So, that's where I'm up to now. As someone who's worked in and around CG modelling for quite a while, but always with models that were already built and relatively easy to run. It's definitely been quite the journey, but I realise I've got a lot more to do, and that's listed here. So there's a fair bit more kind of calibration of some of the finer points of the data that I need to work through, and the parameters obviously are going to be key. And so another example of that would be margins. I thought one of the things I could simulate would be a kind of a government-led investment in getting goods to market through margin subsidies or something like that. A more elaborate treatment of the government sector. ORANI-G is designed to be relatively rudimentary in a lot of features, so that it's readily adaptable and people can build on it. And so it doesn't have an overly complicated accounting for government, surpluses and deficits and budget rules and things like that. Another key thing would be building in sluggish mobility of labour between sectors, so that you could show the kind of importance of that in terms of retraining and redeploying people, and more detailed treatment of households. Non-labour income shares and sources. Obviously, it's very it's kind of easy to set up a household that just gets its labour income from one sector, but then determining what share of other income it should receive it turns out a bit trickier. And so at the moment, that's just a rudimentary kind of ratio based on the labour income, whereas in reality, those workers, tend to be higher income and will probably also receive a greater share of capital income and things like that. So that's pretty much it for me. Happy to pause there. Like I said, very kind of preliminary in nature, and so very happy to take kind of suggestions from people.
Thank you very much, Cedric. Really enjoyed that. I'll open the floor to questions again if you want to put your hand up or type something in the chat. Dom, after you.
Thanks for that presentation. It was really good. I just have I have one question, and I'm guessing the answer will be that this isn't possible. But have you, and it probably depends on the aggregation within the CG model itself. But have you thought about applying this technique and possibly expanding it to different states in Australia? Because there's obviously such different reliance on different types of mining across Australia. It might be useful to be able to see sort of a disaggregated effect, but I assume that's probably not possible given the aggregation.
Yeah, no, well, so there's good and bad news there. Like, it definitely is possible. There's a regional version of ORANI term which you could use. And the work I was doing initially was quite regional. I was doing the Hunter and the Bourne Basin, which are some kind of sub-state regions of Australia. I ended up moving away from that, I guess for a number of reasons. Obviously, like, regional modelling is it serves a purpose, but it gets tricky when it comes to mining, because if you do it at the state level, that works in some ways, but then a lot of the people who work in WA, for example, don't live in WA. And so, or a lot of the people that work in the Hunter Valley probably don't live that close to the Hunter Valley, right? And so getting at the concept of what I want to answer is what's the cohort that's really affected here rather than the region. I know there is a role for place-based kind of impacts and things like that, and dwelling prices would be a classic one in some regions, and I don't doubt that there aren't regional elements to the question, but yeah, I have kind of shifted away from that to look at it from more of a household or agent perspective.
All right, I see. Thanks.
Thanks. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Cedric? I've certainly got one, if not. So yeah, it feels like this. Sorry, Xian, I've started now, so I'll come to you in a second. I think we've got time. It feels like this miner, everyone else split is really key in this work. So I'd be interested to hear more about how you did that, and also, I guess, whether you've got whether there are extensions to that. So you talked about the income thing, and we've discussed the regional aspect, I guess. So I think I used to work with a version of ORANI for Spain, and it had professions, but it also had household incomes. But it almost feels like you're trying to build a kind of semi kind of socioeconomic group. So yeah, I think it'd be interesting to hear more about how you've gone about that and whether there's plans to extend it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There's definitely plans to extend it. So at the moment, there's a multi-house version of ORANI that a bunch of people have used, and probably was the case in Spain. The key thing here is there's different occupation types, right, that you can have on one level in the kind of labour market, as it were. And then there's different household types, and normally there'd be some kind of, you would have some concordance between the two. In this case, I've focused on the second one, right? Because a bunch of different occupation types work in mining. It's mostly, kind of technical and trades people. But in reality, a lot of people, that's where they get their money from. And so what I've done is just said, well, who is that cohort, right? And kind of sought to kind of like extract them from the rest of the population. And yeah, so the data is readily available to do that. It's, I guess, the good news. And it's just a matter of getting your zeros and ones right when it comes to doing the code at the end, which is good. But having done that for labour income, then it gets trickier for capital income. And probably one key extension, I think, is going to have to be to the concept of foreign ownership, right? And like having an agent that isn't really a household in and of itself, it's more a foreign owner of the capital, because that's quite key, especially if I start getting into any kind of like stranded asset type question.
Great, thanks very much. Xian, do you want to come in? You're muted at the moment.
Sorry, this is actually Manho. Can you explain how you finance the lump sum or the subsidy? In particular, the R wage variable, is that after tax wage or the employer wage?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's at the moment, it's quite rudimentary. So it's just a lump sum transfer that is assumed to come off G&E, as it were. And so it's kind of the concept of, they get all income, and you're taking away some of it to compensate this one type of household. Hence, it's very modest macroeconomic impacts. There's no real tax that exists like that. And so I think one extension is going to have to be looking at the funding mechanism for the compensation, and that's where the export tax idea, I think, could be fruitful. And then the real wage variable that I have in there, I believe is after tax, but I'd have to double check.
Can I just check on the export subsidy? Does it apply to fossil fuels as well? So is there a degree of direct mitigation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in the setting I have at the moment, yes, it technically would, actually, which is a bit bad of me. Sorry, I shouldn't do that. And it's probably mitigating it in that regard. So you'd have to remove that. I was looking at a bunch of different, there's a lot of talk here about rare earths and other mining, and then hydrogen, and everyone's got a sector that they think is going to be the next big sector that will help, and so there's probably, a case to kind of look at, which sectors, if any, prove the most fruitful.
Great, thanks. Any other questions for Cedric?
Yeah, I have a quick question in terms of the employment of the miners when you impose the export demand reduction. I was wondering how many, like the quantities, or how many people are moving away from mining and going to other sectors.
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the current form of the model, because it's a long run closure, right? It's complete redeployment in response to that demand shock, and so hence the focus on the wage impacts. But obviously in reality, it's not going to be that easy, right? And so that's where I want to build in, some kind of like CET type transformation, to introduce imperfect mobility, and then perhaps even build in some kind of like pairwise imperfect mobility, because a lot of the skills that are in that sector, most people will tell you, are quite readily adaptable to other sectors, but not necessarily to services or something like that, right? And so that's probably a key, other thing to do, basically.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let's give Cedric a round of applause, however you want to do that. And we'll move on to our third presentation, which is from Xian Hu from Tsinghua University, and she'll be presenting on carbon policies in developed countries, effects on trade and welfare. So over to you, Xian.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Hu Xian, a PhD student from Tsinghua University and the Harbour China project. And I want to first thank the conference organizers for giving us the opportunity to present our work. And this work is still in the early stage of the research, and we are still making improvements to the model. And so I'm very looking forward to getting your comments and feedback. Okay, today. So first, I will begin our motivation. As we all know, the climate is a global common. Unilateral climate policies will suffer from under provision and free riding. Like the EU ETS, they have steadily tightened the system and the permit prices have been rising. And this has raised the worries about the carbon leakage. That is, worry that the reductions in EU emission will be offset by higher emission in the rest of the world when they export more to the EU. And the competitiveness losses due to the less carbon price from the imports. So in the last 2 years, the EU Commission has came out with the proposals to implement bottom carbon adjustment. Basically, it means tariff on imports based on carbon content of the goods, and sometimes it includes export rebates. I will discuss this policy in more detail later, but the point is that other countries without comparable carbon policies, like some developing countries, but they are also a large export to EU, especially China, which is a major trade partner of the EU, is concerned about these proposals. So our goal here is to simulate the BCA proposals using a global trade model to see how different regions of the world will be affected on trade patterns, output, and welfare. Okay, our model is a multi-sector, multi-regional general equilibrium model of the world economic growth with a dynamic recursive structure. That is with exogenous saving rates and that driving the capital accumulation. Our focus is on the EU policy, and we may also consider the possibility of the US implementation. So this leads us to aggregate to 10 world regions, which are the major exporter to EU or exporter of the fossil fuels. And we aggregate it to 29 industries. There are 6 are energy related, like coal, oil, mining, gas, and electricity, and 15 are the manufacturing sectors. And our model is based on the latest GTAP 10 database over the 2020 to 2040 horizon. So I will briefly introduce our model, though within period structure of the economy is a standard formulation used in many CGE models. So the production is represented by constant elasticity substitution functions, where an energy value added bundle substitute include, and also the LES consumption function with the flexible labor supply. And the CES function represents imperfect substitution of the imports and domestic production, and also between different source regions of imports. And the government revenues in each region are derived from tariff, indirect taxes on consumption and productions, and direct taxes on labor income. And we first simulate a base case path over 2014 to 2040. We do not impose any carbon prices in the 10 regions. So we give a short summary of the growth rates of key variables. You can see the GDP growth and CO2 emission from the world and the EU. And in the current version, we just assume 0 TFP and have a very low baseline growth to get the lower bound on the policy costs. So in the future version, we will have a more realistic baseline growth. Let me briefly introduce the EU ETS policy started in 2005. This policy covers a few high CO2 emission sectors, like the refining chemicals and ferrous metals and so on. As we can notice, the permit price increased a lot in recent years, from $6 per ton in about 2016 to 2020, the $92 per ton. So a certain share of permits is allocated free to some producers, except electricity. And during the 2013 to 2020, the average free share is about 47%, and the rest are auction. So how we model the ETS case? We denote the ETS cover industry by SETS. And first, we calculate the shadow price per unit of fuel inputs. This is a carbon permit price times the efficient coefficient. And then the producers in ETS sectors are required to have permits for each ton of CO2 from the fossil fuels used. So we calculate the buyer's price of energy input E to producers in ETS industry, that is PB, including the permit price. And as we mentioned before, the ETS sectors will get some quarter of permits for free. So we represent this allocation as a subsidy on output. But the electricity sector, which are not allocated any free permits, this means the electricity price will incorporate fully carbon price. And the recycling of this revenue is also important. In this scenario, we cut the factor tax on labor so that the real government purchase are maintained at the base case level for each year. And this will allow us a simple comparison of household utility across policies without having to worry about the different levels of public good. The EU does not discuss the future path of the overall carbon cap, nor the expected permit prices. So we computed annual average of the observed permit price for 2014 to 2021. And we show the path of permit price in this figure. And we can see a sharp rise in 2020 to 2021. And we then assume a smooth projection for permit price. This can avoid these sharp changes. So for our long run analysis. So our projection started from the price of about $3 in 2014 per ton of CO2 and rising linearly and reaching to about $100 in 2040. Then let me briefly introduce the CBAM rules proposed by EU 2020. The CBAM will initially apply to cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity. And importers in EU should purchase certificates based on the carbon emission of these products. The CBAM certificate price will mirror the ETS weekly price, and this will be follow operational in 2026. At the same time, EU will eliminate free allocation of ETS and the CBAM sectors by 10 years, 10% decreasing for 1 year. And finally, the revenues of CBAM certificate will be contributed to the EU budgets. So here is how we model the EU CBAM. First, we denote the CBAM set as SCBA, and we calculate the tariff rate based on the emission intensity in the exporting country. This is the tariff rate per ton of CO2. That is the TRBTA CO2. This is the same price as the EU ETS price. And this rate times the theta Q, which covers the emissions from direct combustion of fossil fuels and also the embedded CO2 in the electricity used. So we get the tariff rate and calculate the landed value of imports, where the PWM is a world price and the PM is the landed price of imports. And we also consider the regular tariff TM and the non-tariff barrier equivalent TM. So the EC also discussed the phasing in of this tariff in parallel with the rising share of auction permits. We thus set the bottom carbon price equal to the permit price multiplied by the auction share. So this is the 1 minus the free share and multiplies the ETS permit price. Okay. And then we define the leakage rate as a ratio of increase in carbon emission in non-policy regions to the reduction in policy regions when their system move from one policy to another. And also to maintain symmetry with the ETS case, we also recycle the burden carbon revenue in this scenario by reducing the tax rates on labor factors. While EU does not mention the rebates for export, but this option has been often discussed by many analysts. So in that scenario, we will also consist of a full burden adjustment with both tariff and export rebates. And these rebates are set equal to the effective carbon tax paid on producing this good exported. And this figure gave us the estimated carbon tariff rates unit. It is the dollar of tax per dollar of imports in 2026. So the lowest rates are for chemicals and non-ferro metals, while the highest rates are for electricity, non-metal mineral products, and the ferrous metals. And we also give the ETS revenue flows. As the free allocation share falls and the ETS price go on, the auction revenue rises from $60 billion in 2026 to $160 billion in 2040. So this is 1.8% relative to total EU revenues in 2040. And the amount that is allocated free will be represented as the output subsidy. This falls from 18 billion in 2026 to 0 in 2035. And also all the ETS auction revenues are recycled by cutting the labor factor taxes. Okay, let me show you some results. First, the impact of ETS on key variables in 2026 compared to the base case. Let me highlight the main points. For the EU, the 2026 GDP is lower by 0.45%, and while the CO2 emission falls 1.1%, and there are also some interesting shifts in the composition of fuel use in EU due into the structure of electricity production. And in the other regions of the world, there are different effects depending on whether they are energy exports. First, we can say the China, which is an energy importer and a major exporter to EU. You can say the China GDP in 2026 has only a small increase change with the 0.21 increase in exports and 0.75 increase in imports. And over time, as the carbon price increasing and the auction share rises, EU GDP falls by 0.85 and they have a fall in consumption and aggregate exports. And you can see China aggregate exports still rising, and the imports also rise. The improvements in their items will lead to a higher consumption and also the household utility. And the EU, the CO2 emission in the EU in 2040 is lower. It's 2.9% lower than the base case, but the emission rise in all other countries of the world, except the oil exporters. And so the global CO2 only fall by 0.16%, but the leakage rate has rise to the 34%. And you can see this is a huge rise from 2026 to 2040. This table gives us the changes in sector output and the trade for the EU and China. I marked in red the ETS sectors, and you can see the higher cost of production in ETS sectors raises their price. This will cut the demand, and their output falls a lot, like petroleum and electricity chemicals. These are falls a lot. And they also reduce their oil and gas input, and thus the output of coal and the gas utility fall a lot. There is an increase in imports in the EU in the ETS goods, like the chemicals, ferrometals, and fall in their exports due to the losses of competitiveness. This change will also lead to the fall of GDP. And from this table, we can also see China increase its exports of the ETS good, like chemicals and ferrous metals, and reduce their imports because the EU price of these goods are rising. This will result in a small increase in output. So over time, the auction share rises and the permit price go up. The pressure on the ETS sectors increase. You can see in 2040, the output of the ETS sectors in EU shrink a lot, like petroleum, chemicals, and the non-metal minerals. And China exports of the goods ETS rises over time. Okay, during the time, I will skip this one. So let's quickly show you some results of the CBAM. We consider the difference between this case to the ETS case, ETS only case. So there is only a trivial difference in GDP in 2026, and even by 2040. The fall of GDP in EU are minor, and the CO2 emission in the EU are now higher than in the ETS case by 33% compared to the 2.9% reduction in the ETS case. However, the global emissions is even lower by a small amount tariff due to the great reduction in leakage rate. You can see the leakage rate in 2040 now decreased to 14%, which is 34% in the ETS case. This is due to the great reductions in emissions like Russia, India, and the rest of the world. And this table gives us sector impacts in 2040 with CBAM against the ETS case. So we can see the imports of the most ETS goods in the EU are lower with the tariff protection. And this leads to a higher level of output of these sectors. The protective effects of the tariff are not uniform across sectors. This may be due to different elasticity of substitution. And the changes in sectors in China also gave us some intuition. When the carbon tariff imposed, China exports of the CBAM goods falls a lot, like the ferrous metal and the non-metal minerals like cement. And we will skip this one. And let me briefly conclude. We found that the EU carbon pricing policies have significant carbon leakage due to high fuel use and energy-intensive manufacturing in the rest of the world. And secondly, carbon tariff reduced carbon leakage by more than half. They have a sizable effect on improving the competitiveness of firms in carbon pricing countries. And the carbon tariffs have a very small additional negative impact on the world economy, even for the large reduction in leakage. Third, the EU carbon price have a negative economic impact on the GDP of to the Russia oil exporting countries, Canada, and other countries, but the additional of carbon tariff will hurt China, India, and oil export. Okay, that's all. Thanks for your listening. If you have any questions, please tell us.
Thank you very much, Xian. Really interesting. I feel like I could spend all day in those results. Do we have any questions? So hands up or write something in the chat. I'm happy to start things off. So you said in your introduction that I think you said that China was quite worried about the impacts of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Would it be fair to say that one of your conclusions is perhaps they don't need to worry because the beneficial effects from the ETS outweigh the negative effects from CBAM?
I think because in our simulation, the tariff will from a very little amount to a lot, and this is one reason. And the second one is from China's export to EU, maybe like cement and some other metals. This is not the major part of export to EU, and because in this simulation we set the sectors like cement is also a small part of the non-metal or mineral products, but we just set all the sectors due to the GTAP sector set. So in the future we also consider to introduce a share of the exact sectors to our model. So maybe this will give a more exact result. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? I have one more, if not. So you said the ETS was revenue neutral and was kind of recycled as a factor subsidy.
Yeah.
And then I think you said that you did two scenarios with the CBAM. Is this right? One where it just got added to the EU budget, and one where that was also revenue neutral and got recycled as a factor subsidy?
Actually, in the CBAM scenario, we also recycle the tariff revenue and the ETS revenue all to the EU budget. But as we said, the EU budget consists of the factor tax and other production tax, and we want to keep the EU government revenue to maintain as a same level from the base case. So we just cut the production tax and the factor tax. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think that's perfectly justifiable. But I wonder if you could get a sense for how much that impact is affecting things, because it seems like, in a sense, the EU is winning both ways, that it gets some money from its own policy to reduce taxes, and then it gets some money from its tariffs, which also go into reducing its own taxes.
Oh, yes. Now we consider this. We will calculate one parameters that shows how reduction of the other tax, and maybe in the later round we can consider different impacts. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Angelo, go ahead.
Yes. I have a clarification question. I think I lost the beginning of the presentation. Do you assume any climate policy in other regions of the world, like in the US or any other country? And if you don't, how a potential climate policy in other countries would affect the enforcement or the application of the CBAM?
Yeah, thank you so much. Because the CBAM also says they will exception for the countries who also have the carbon price, and we know the US now it doesn't have carbon price, a national carbon price, and the China also have some ETS, but only for electricity sectors. And some regional ETS pilot. So we think as a first round, EU may not consider to admit this carbon price, but in the future we also considered the US as a carbon price, and also we can calculate some other tax in other countries and to see how they interact with each other. Okay, thank you. That's a really important problem.
Thanks very much. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Xian. Really interesting. And we'll move on now to our fourth presentation, which is from Xiurong, who is the assistant professor or an assistant professor at Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And I think it looks like you're on a different system. So hopefully your mic's working okay now. So over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay, and so can everyone see my screen? Okay, so thank you, and hi everyone. I'm Xiurong Hu from Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and it's my great honor to give this speech about China's environmental protection tax and carbon pricing. And to solve China's environmental programs, Chinese government has released a number of air pollution control policies, including the environmental protection law and 5 years plan, and so on. And at the beginning of 2008, the Chinese government has implicated the environmental protection tax law in the whole country. And this new tax law is perceived as an aggressive policy that tends to establish a taxation system for promoting air pollution control. However, presently, very few studies have quantified the effectiveness of the environmental protection tax. So our study is mainly focused on the environmental protection tax. As we know that for environmental policy analysis, the computable general equilibrium model is one of the most useful tools, since it integrates energy use and emissions released with economic activities to reflect the dynamic interactions between the economy and the environment. Thus, we first built our own 30-region CGE model. And we first combined the multi-regional input-output tables with other Chinese statistic yearbooks to build 30 regions sum table. And then we'll also combine the emission data from the PKU inventory and the energy balance tables to provide regional and sectoral air pollution accounting. And after model validation, we put the environmental protection tax into the CGE model, just convert the specific duty rate into the ad valorem tax rate to put this module in the CGE model. And then we see, according to the environmental protection tax law, it is levied on all enterprise except emissions from agriculture and transport sectors. And the first three items of pollutants should be levied on the tax. And this, we use the pollution equivalent. The pollution equivalent value is the air pollution quantity that takes into account the harmfulness of the pollutants. And it also accounts the cost of dealing with them. So after our calculation, the SO2, NOx, and CO are the first three air pollutants considered in this model. And the law also, according to the law, the tax rate vary among 1.22 RMB to 12 RMB per pollution equivalent value, depending on different regions. And in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the current policy, we set three scenarios. Scenario two is the current policy that different regions have different tax rate. We can see in this figure that the Jing-Jin-Ji area has the largest tax rate. And the scenario one is the lowest tax rate in our region, and scenario three, the highest tax rate in our region. So we can first see the tax impact on national emissions and GDP. We can see that under all scenario, SO2 and NOx has the largest declines, because this is because the emission impacts of this tax have are dominated by the SO2 and the NOx related sectors. And the green bars are the current policy. We compare the current policy with scenario one and scenario three. We can say that the current policy are about 2 times larger than the lowest bound of the tax, and about 3 to 4 times smaller than the highest bound of the tax. So we can say that large potential emission reduction existed, that a more ambitious tax rate is necessary for China to reduce air pollution. And besides, we can say that this tax has negative effect on GDP, but fortunately, the GDP loss is small. So this is our first study. And then the current tax law indicate that the tax revenue are being a part of local government income without any return. Above the results show that this tax has negative effect on GDP. However, previous studies showed that returning the tax revenue to reduce other distortionary tax or transferring the revenue to other agents might have double dividend. So in order to explore the effects of the tax reform, we set 6 tax reform scenario. Scenario 1 is our current policy, and scenario 2 is the highest bound of the tax law, and that we increase the tax rate into the largest, but without revenue return. And the third scenario is that we use the highest tax rate and refund the revenues to reduce household income tax. And the fourth scenario is that we refund our revenues to reduce enterprise income tax. And the fifth scenario is that all the revenues are earmarked to install solar PV power. And at last, we use half of the revenues to reduce household income tax and half of them invest in solar PV. From this figure, we can say that if we strengthen the tax rate to the largest and then reform the revenues to reduce household income tax, could be the most efficient way, because compared to our current policy, it could reduce more air pollution and also burden on less GDP loss. And if we want to reduce more air pollutants, we can use half of the revenues to reduce household income tax and half of them to invest in solar PV, because we can reduce more air pollutants and with the relative the same GDP loss as the highest tax rate without returning. And this is our previous 2 studies. And in our recent studies, we also found that carbon price could help China to achieve carbon net zero in 2060. So in detail, with the increase of carbon price, the carbon dioxide emissions will reduce largely in first, and the reduction rate will decline after 2045. And also the carbon price will reduce GDP. So in addition to the domestic environmental protection tax and the carbon price, the recent studies also found that so many air pollutants are impacted by international trade. So we, based on our previous studies, and we built scenarios including environmental protection tax and carbon price, and also the tariff changes. And to make it to enable a meaningful scenario, we set the environmental protection tax from 2 RMB per pollution equivalent to 12 RMB per pollution equivalent, and the limit on 50 RMB per ton carbon dioxide to 300 RMB per ton carbon dioxide pricing. And this setting is based on the other studies. And also we consider the decrease and increase of the tariffs for all import goods. So we put the three scenarios together to see what will happen. And this figure is the emission changes under three scenarios, and is including so many air pollutants, including SO2, NOx, TSP, PM10 and PM2.5, and CO, VOC, and other, as well as carbon dioxide emissions. We can say that the changes of air pollutants and carbon dioxide emissions under different scenarios. We found that the carbon price has the largest decline in all air pollutants. So we can say that applying carbon price in China may result in much greater air pollutants emission reductions compared to the environmental protection tax. And the tariff-wise have an insignificant impact on air pollutants compared to these two scenarios. And in detail, we compare the emissions and the costs under environmental protection test and the carbon pricing. Here we define the consumption costs to GDP to indicate costs. So from this figure, we can see that although the carbon price has greater impact on emission reduction, the environmental protection tax is more cost effective to the carbon pricing policy. And to why we can see the sectoral burden on both of the scenario. This is because that for the environmental protection tax, large number of emission reductions are burdened on electricity power sector. And the electricity power sector is more cost effective compared to other sectors. But for the carbon pricing, in addition to electricity power sector, this policy also has large impact on other sectors. For example, as the non-metal manufacturing sector and the chemistry sector. And these two sectors has more costly to electricity sector. So the environmental protection tax is more cost effective to the carbon pricing. And this result also indicate that the coverage of sectors will significantly impact on cost. And we ran the scenarios together. We can say that narrowing carbon price on top of the environmental protection tax will achieve additional emissions reduction, but it will also increase the cost to society compared to using the environmental protections alone. And we also take some results from the tariff-wise. We can see that the tariff-wise, this is increased tariff-wise, and this is the tariff-wise decline in 25%. We can see that tariff-wise has a large impact on GDP, but slightly impact on air pollution emissions. Thus, the change of tariff-wise could cause significant impact on radiation efficiency. We define the radiation efficiency as the ratio of emission reduction to GDP loss. And for regional, we compare the current EPT scenario with the combine our current APT policy with the carbon price, we can see that the carbon price could increase the air pollution mitigation, but also strengthen the burden of GDP in most provinces. And while some provinces could result in air reduction and GDP increase at the same time, as we say that provincial distribution is vital for regional inequality, and we could introduce relatively smaller tax rate on this province with large GDP loss, or we could provide subsidy for these cities, for these regions at the same time. So for conclusion, we can say that the carbon price in China may result in greater emission reduction than that of the environmental protection tax. But the environmental protection tax policy is more cost-effective to the carbon pricing policy. And for interactions between these two different policies, or results show that the carbon pricing is most reductant to the environmental protection tax, while the environmental protection tax is complementary to carbon price policy. And the tariff has large effect on GDP, but slight effect on air pollutants emissions. And on provincial level or on regional level, carbon price could increase the air pollution mitigation, but also strengthen the burden of GDP in most provinces. So that's all my presentation. And our last work is still ongoing. So any suggestions could be appreciated. And thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Another rich set of results and policy insights. I particularly liked your visualization of how the presence of one policy affects the efficiency of another policy. I really like that. Might have to steal that. So do we have any questions for Xiurong? I've got one to start us off. I was wondering if you could say anything about the differences in abatement options between the CO2 emissions and the air pollutants, and I guess maybe as part of that, like how the air pollutant emissions are kind of attached. Are they attached to an input use or to kind of the production process? And yeah, how does that affect the kind of abatement options between them on the one hand and CO2 on the other?
Oh, yeah, thank you. You mean the your question mean the policy the different impact on the carbon dioxide and air pollutants? Is that
I think
right?
Before you get to the impact, the kind of, so if an industry faces a tax on air pollutants,
Yeah.
How can it reduce those air pollutants? Does it just have to reduce output, or can it switch its input makeup?
Yeah, the price, the tax will increase their price, and they will reduce their output, and then reduce the air pollutants. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And that's true for CO2 as well, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Any other questions? Either put your hand up or type it in the chat. So one more from me, I guess, is why do you think it is that, so I liked your kind of GDP against emissions reductions chart. Why do you think it is that kind of for us the same level of GDP reduction, it's the air pollutant policy, the EPT, that drives a bigger emissions reduction than the CO2 policy?
Sorry, you mean the tax reform scenarios, or
just in general? It seems like the EPT has a bigger effect on emissions for a given GDP reduction. Why do you think that is?
I think there is one reason that the sectoral coverage is different. I think maybe the in our scenario or in our current policy, the coverage, the sectoral coverage is larger in environmental protection tax than the carbon pricing.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thanks. Any other questions or comments? If not, I think we can say thank you very much and give you a round of applause. And big thanks to all our presenters and to Uris for hosting. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks all. Bye.